The Pacific was burning. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, radio waves carried messages and code orders for artillery, coordinates for bombing runs, and distress calls from Marines pinned under fire. But in 1942, one American division began sending transmissions that no Japanese cryptographer, no matter how skilled, could even begin to understand. The words flowed fast, rhythmic, and ancient, spoken by men who had grown up herding sheep on mesas and chanting prayers. Beneath the red cliffs of Arizona and New Mexico, they were the Navajo code talkers, and their weapon was a language so complex, so deeply rooted in culture and oral tradition, that it became the most unbreakable code of the entire war. When the Japanese first intercepted these transmissions, they assumed they were hearing some new American cipher system. Yet after months of monitoring, their best linguists were baffled. The words didn't match any known tongue. They had no alphabet, no written form, and every syllable carried layers of meaning shaped by centuries of oral storytelling. What they didn't realize was that the language they were hearing came from one of the oldest cultures. In North America, a language spoken fluently by fewer than 30 people outside the Navajo Nation. At the time, the idea came from a man named Philip Johnston, the son of a missionary who had grown up among the Navajo and spoke their language fluently. He had served in World War I and understood the vulnerabilities of field communication. When he heard that the Marines were looking for a secure code, he approached them with a radical idea: use a living language as a weapon. At first, military officials laughed. A spoken code? It sounded absurd. But Johnston invited them to a demonstration. 2 Navajo volunteers sat in separate rooms and transmitted a complex military message in their native tongue. Within seconds, the second man translated it perfectly. The officers, wide-eyed, admitted it. The enemy would never crack this. From there, the program was born in secrecy. In May 1942, 29 Navajo men were recruited at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. They weren't told much, only that their language would serve their country. These men built the first version of the code from scratch. They substituted Navajo words for military terms: turtle for tank, chicken hawk for dive bomber, iron fish for submarine. The alphabet was encoded too, using Navajo words corresponding to English letters. Every piece of vocabulary was memorized. Nothing was written down. To the Japanese, the broadcast sounded like a jumble of sounds. To the Marines, they were clear orders for victory. The code talkers trained relentlessly. Each man had to master both English and Navajo to perfection and learn to think in 2 languages at once. Their code was so efficient that a 3-line English message could be transmitted and decoded in under 20 seconds, faster than any cipher machine of the era. In the chaos of battle, that speed saved lives. At first, many in the military didn't understand what made Navajo unique. It wasn't just complex, it was structurally alien to most world languages. With tonal shifts, verb-heavy syntax, and no written standard, even fluent English speakers couldn't catch its rhythm. A single word could change meaning depending on pitch, context, or even speaker. A non-native listener had no chance. And while Japanese intelligence had broken several Allied codes, they could not even begin to map this one. Every intercepted transmission seemed like nonsense. By 1943, Navajo code talkers were on nearly every major Pacific island. On Guadalcanal, they directed artillery against Japanese counterattacks. On Tarawa, they called naval bombardments in real time. On Saipan and Guam, their messages guided air raids that cleared the way for infantry. And by the time the Marines reached Iwo Jima in 1945, Navajo voices were on every frequency, carrying orders from beachheads to command posts. Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima during the first 2 days alone." 6 Navajo operators sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. The Japanese, desperate to understand, even captured Allied radios and played back recorded messages. Some believed the Americans were using a form of Asian dialect. Others thought it was a disguised local code. They brought in Chinese, Korean, and Pacific Islander linguists. None recognized a single word. Eventually, the Japanese command declared the transmissions impossible to decipher. Yet for the Navajo code talkers, the danger was constant. They carried their radios through jungles, across coral beaches, and into foxholes under fire. Many were mistaken for enemy soldiers by their own side, and had to carry special identification cards proving they were Marines. They lived in the same mud, heat, and fear as every man around them. But their job carried an invisible weight. If captured, they could never reveal their code, no matter what, behind the static and the gunfire. There was something deeply symbolic about what they were doing. For centuries, the U.S. government had tried to erase native languages through boarding schools and forced assimilation. Children were beaten for speaking their mother tongue. Now that very language was saving American lives. The irony was not lost on the Navajo men who sat by their radios, whispering ancient syllables over modern technology, fusing heritage and war. By late 1944, the Navajo code had grown to include over 600 words. Only the code talkers could update or revise it, and they guarded it fiercely. No written dictionary existed. Every term lived in memory alone. When a new piece of equipment or tactic was introduced, they created new words instantly, keeping the system fluid and alive. The U.S. military never once had to change or replace the code, not even when the Japanese, its intelligence services, expanded their interception efforts. As the Pacific War intensified, so did the reliance on these voices. On Iwo Jima, messages often traveled through layers of gunfire, sandstorms, and chaos. Yet the Navajo code remained flawless. Commanders began to trust it above all else. When a message arrived stamped with a Navajo signature, it was taken as absolute truth. The men themselves never sought glory. They were quiet, disciplined, and loyal to one another and their mission. When asked after the war what they felt about their role, many said the same thing. They were simply doing their duty. But as their words cut through the fog of battle, carrying victory across the Pacific, no one realized that the most unbreakable code in modern warfare wasn't built in a lab or by cryptographers. It was born centuries earlier. Spoken in the wind-swept mesas of the Navajo Nation, and as the Japanese continued to strain every resource trying to decode the transmissions, one question haunted their intelligence officers. How could such a simple-sounding language hold so much power? By 1945, the Navajo code talkers were no longer a secret within the Marine Corps. They were an indispensable part of every operation. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the coral reefs of Peleliu, they had become the unseen pulse of communication. Yet, despite their value, they were still treated as shadows, unacknowledged in public, unrecognized in reports, and unrecorded in most after-action summaries. The secrecy that protected their mission also erased their names from the story of victory. When American cryptographers reviewed intercepted Japanese signals, they realized something remarkable. While every other Allied code had been broken at least once during the war, the Navajo code had not suffered a single compromise, not one. The Japanese had managed to penetrate British, Chinese, and even partially American systems, but not this one. In interrogation reports after the war, captured Japanese intelligence officers admitted they couldn't even identify what language they were hearing. It sounded like chanting, one said, like music from a ceremony. On the front lines, the code talkers were everywhere, crouched behind rocks, soaked in mud, holding radios that weighed more than rifles. They moved with the assault waves, transmitting coordinates, casualty counts, and ammunition requests. When machine gun nests opened fire, they called for airstrikes. When units became lost in the jungle, they guided them back. Their words traveled faster than fear could spread. Every syllable they spoke carried precision that machines could never achieve. On Saipan, one team coordinated a massive artillery barrage that saved an entire battalion pinned down by Japanese tanks. On Guam, code talkers relayed bombing coordinates under sniper fire, refusing to stop even when bullets struck the sand beside them. Their messages didn't need encryption machines or codebooks, just breath, memory, and discipline. The Japanese would often triangulate their positions, hoping to silence the mysterious voices that seemed to predict every American move. But by the time enemy fire reached their last transmission point, The Navajos had already moved on, radios strapped to their backs. Whispering their code into another ridge, what made the code so effective wasn't only the language, it was the human mind behind it. Each message was constructed using Navajo words that represented English letters and military terms. But the tone and speed of delivery were crucial. The talkers were trained to speak rapidly and clearly, avoiding even the smallest hesitation. A mistake could send artillery shells miles off target. To maintain accuracy, each battalion had pairs of code talkers who worked in perfect rhythm, one sending, one receiving. Their voices almost synchronized through the static. There were times when even American officers didn't understand the power of what was happening through those radios. On Iwo Jima, one colonel, frustrated by a delay, demanded to know why the Marines couldn't use standard English. The operator beside him replied quietly, "Because by the time you send your message through regular code, we'll already have the answer." Moments later, a Navajo message went out and came back. Translation complete, order delivered, target destroyed. The colonel said nothing more. The irony of their mission was profound. The same U.S. government that had once banned the Navajo language now depended on it for survival. Many of the men remembered being punished as children for speaking it in boarding schools. Some had scars from those days, physical reminders of an era that sought to erase their voice. Yet now, that voice was saving thousands. The code talkers often joked about the irony, but deep down, it filled them with pride. They were fighting not only for America, but for the survival of their culture. In the field, they carried both modern radios and ancient beliefs. Many performed small rituals before missions, whispering prayers for protection, or clarity of speech for the safe return of their brothers. The Navajo language carried more than information. It carried spirit. When they transmitted words for thunder, storm, or eagle, it wasn't just metaphorical. It was ancestral power flowing through a modern war machine. Despite their secrecy, rumors spread among American troops about the mysterious language men. Some Marines swore that as long as the Navajos were on the air, they could feel a strange sense of calm, as if victory itself had a voice. When they heard those fast, rhythmic syllables cutting through static, they knew artillery would land where it was needed, supplies would arrive, and reinforcements would move in time. The language became a symbol of reliability, something pure amid the chaos of war. The Japanese, on the other hand, grew increasingly desperate. They brought in experts in linguistics from across Asia, believing the Americans had invented a code based on multiple dialects. Some even speculated it was a hybrid of Chinese and native Philippine tongues. In frustration, Japanese intercept teams began calling the transmissions the ghost code. Their commanders ordered them to focus on breaking it, but it was impossible. Without knowledge of Navajo culture, even the simplest word was indecipherable. Turtle, chicken hawk, iron fish. To them, these sounded random, meaningless. They couldn't know that turtle meant a tank, or that iron fish called forth submarines from the depths of the Pacific. The code talkers didn't just confuse the enemy, they humiliated them. Japanese intelligence had prided itself on its precision and discipline. To be outwitted not by a machine but by a group of young men speaking an ancient tribal language was unthinkable. It was the ultimate reversal. A culture the world once saw as primitive had built an unbreakable system in the age of global warfare. Still, the Navajo men carried their burden in silence. They couldn't tell anyone, not their families, not their communities, what they were doing. Their work was classified, and secrecy was absolute. Some mothers believed their sons were simply radio operators. Some didn't even know their sons were in combat. After the war, many returned home and went back to herding sheep, tending fields, or working construction. They spoke little of what they had done, bound by the oaths they had taken. But among themselves, they shared quiet memories. The sound of a signal coming through at midnight, the trembling of the ground when artillery responded to their code, the feeling of power, knowing that the words of their ancestors had become the sharpest weapon of the U.S. Marine Corps. As the war neared its end, one of the senior code talkers on Okinawa wrote in his diary, "We are the voices of the storm. They don't see us, but they hear us. And when they hear us, the world changes." And indeed, the world was changing. The ancient and the modern had merged through the crackle of a radio signal. The Navajo language, once silenced, had found its roar. When the guns finally went quiet in August 1945, the Navajo code talkers packed their radios and walked back down the beaches they had fought to secure. The Pacific sky, once streaked with tracer fire, now shimmered with the heat of peace. But their mission wasn't over, it was erased. Orders came down that the code was to remain classified. The same men who had been the lifeline of Marine divisions were told to forget what they had done, to keep silent about the language that had helped end the war, and so they did. For decades, they carried their stories like locked vaults. The American public celebrated victory. Parades rolled through cities and names of generals were etched into stone. Yet in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, the code talkers returned to lives of quiet obscurity. Some came home to dirt floors and empty cupboards. Others faced the same discrimination that had driven their families into boarding schools years before. Their contribution, invisible, intangible, was lost amid the roar of jet engines and atomic headlines. They had changed the course of history. A few even knew their names. Within military circles, however, their impact was unmistakable. The Navajo system had set a new precedent for secure communications. It had proven that speed, clarity, and cultural uniqueness could outperform any mechanical cipher. When post-war analysts reviewed Pacific campaigns, they found a striking pattern wherever code talkers operated. Coordination was faster, friendly fire incidents were fewer, and command reactions more precise. Commanders quietly noted the results. Future training manuals began emphasizing speed over encryption. Complexity, a direct legacy of the Navajo voice. On the psychological front, the code's unbreakable nature had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield. Japanese officers later confessed that the mysterious transmissions demoralized them. Every time they intercepted the strange language, the new American units were coordinating attacks faster than they could respond. They nicknamed it the Whispering Wind, believing it carried orders from some unknown Allied intelligence division. They never realized they were hearing the preserved heartbeats of a people America had once tried to silence. Back home, the talkers lived with a double identity, veterans and guardians of a language the government had once outlawed. Some took jobs with the Bureau of Indian Affairs or local police. Others returned to shepherding, carpentry, or teaching. But when they spoke to their children, they made sure the old words survived. Around campfires, in family kitchens, under star-filled skies, they retold fragments of their wartime codes, not the exact phrases, but the rhythm, the pride, the strength. The Navajo tongue, scarred by years of repression, became a language of triumph once more. In the early Cold War years, the U.S. military revisited the code. With tensions rising in Korea and beyond, analysts reviewed whether the Navajo system could be reactivated. The answer was complicated. Machines were becoming faster. Satellites were on the horizon. But the human voice still carried an element of trust that no device could match. For a time, the idea resurfaced to train another generation of native communicators. But as the age of digital cryptography dawned, the Navajo voices faded into the archives of memory. Recognition came late, too late for many. It wasn't until 1968 that the Code Talker program was finally declassified. By then, many of its veterans had passed away. Those still living were old men, their hair silver, their hands weathered by both war and time. When journalists came to interview them, they spoke humbly, often deflecting credit to the boys who didn't come home. They described the sound of artillery, the heat of the Pacific, the smell of gun oil and sea salt. But when asked about their language, their faces softened. "It's sacred," one said. "It protected us, and we protected it." The nation slowly began to understand. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan issued a proclamation recognizing the Navajo Code Talkers' contribution, naming August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. Decades later, in 2001, the surviving talkers received congressional gold medals in Washington. D.C. many wept silently as their names were read. Others simply stood at attention, wearing uniforms that hadn't fit in years. Their medals gleamed like echoes of the radios they once carried through gunfire, yet even as history tried to honor them, the most powerful tribute remained the one embedded in their legacy. Linguists began studying the Navajo tongue not as a relic, but as a masterpiece of structure, a language built on layers of meaning, metaphor, and rhythm. Universities opened programs to preserve it. Young Navajos, once discouraged from speaking their ancestral language, now learned it proudly, aware that it had once been America's greatest shield. The code talkers had turned a tool of survival into a monument of identity. In the decades that followed, the story became a symbol of reconciliation. Military academies taught it as an example of ingenuity and respect for indigenous cultures. Filmmakers and historians called it one of the greatest intelligence achievements of World War II. But for the men who lived it, the true victory was simpler. They had proven that their culture, once targeted for destruction, was powerful enough to save a nation. Even now, the legacy of their work resonates across modern warfare. Secure communication, from encrypted satellites to battlefield networks, still echoes their principle that the strength of a code lies not just in mathematics, but in the minds and hearts of those who create it. The Navajo code talkers didn't just send messages, they embodied resilience. They showed that knowledge rooted in tradition could defeat empires of technology. In their twilight years, some of the surviving talkers gathered again at reunions in Window Rock. They sat beneath flags they had once fought under, sharing laughter, old songs, and quiet tears. Radios sat silent on the tables before them, heavy, scratched, but still humming faintly with memory. When asked what they thought of the world now, one old Marine replied softly, "We did our duty. The code is still strong." And perhaps he was right. Every time the desert wind sweeps across Navajo land, every time a young child learns to speak the language once forbidden, the code lives again. It's no longer about secrecy, it's about survival, about honor, about the endurance of words that refuse to die. The world remembers them now. The men who turned an ancient melody into a weapon of victory. Their radios have fallen silent, but the message remains that even in the most mechanized war in history, the human voice, clear, steadfast, and born from heritage, was the one sound no enemy could break.